if you look at the fields of psychology and neuroscience, they're quite siloed. Psychology tends to deal with the mind, with our psychology, with our thought patterns, whereas neuroscience tends to deal with the brain, the physiology, the anatomy, what we can measure. And so what we've discovered is that there is a way to bridge that gap.
Geoff Cole and Chad Olin are the co-founders of Supermind, a technology and methodology that uses brainwaves to discover hidden trauma, reshape the nervous system, and bridge the gap between psychology and neuroscience.
When people look at the brain, they do it in the medical framework. And in mental wellness, that may not really be the best way to go, because we all have different frameworks physically as well as mentally. Because our mind lives in the electricity of our nervous system all over our whole body.
Their groundbreaking work reveals how we have the power to shape our brains.
There's a really cool study that you guys may have seen with the Cleveland Clinic that showed that someone who's visualizing exercise actually has physiological changes in their muscles without doing any physical activity. So if you just think of applying that to your brain and applying that to your thoughts, we have that power to visualize, to use affirmations. And we call it self-directed neuroplasticity.
Chad and Geoff show us that mental wellness is measurable and changeable.
While we're doing those directed thought exercises in a session, we're measuring the unconscious brainwaves. And we'll see if there's resistance to that affirmation in specific regions of the brain and specific frequency bands. That indicates that there is a disagreement of that intention, of that proposed belief in the subconscious belief that's measurable in theta in the parietal lobe.
Before we get into this conversation, I want to ask you to join this amazing community of consciousness explorers. This whole idea of pursuing expanded consciousness and the boundaries of human potential while living a modern life is relatively new, which is why we interview revered masters, teachers, experts, and practitioners to help you on your own journey. To stay up to date on the latest conversations, simply click subscribe below and you'll be notified each time a new episode comes out. I am so grateful for all of your support and comments. I love reading them. Now let's dive into this conversation. Alrighty, Chad, G, what is going on? It's great to see both of you.
Good to see you, Scott. How are you?
I'm awesome. I have the Supermind mastermind right here, which is exciting. And I think where I wanted to kick this off is really just to shine a light on something that I didn't really fully comprehend or recognize until my own journey in working with you guys and getting to know you better. And I think that's this fact that, neuroscience and psychology are pretty separate right now. And I'd love to just for you, one of you or both of you, to just talk about kind of current state so that people can wrap their head around just the way that we evaluate these things currently.
Maybe I could jump in on that first and then and tee it up for G to talk a little bit about his background and his story. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. And if you look at the fields of psychology and neuroscience, they're quite siloed. And they each have their own educational curriculum. They each have their own KOLs, their own areas of expertise. Psychology tends to deal with the mind, with our psychology, with our thought patterns, whereas neuroscience tends to deal with the brain, the physiology, the anatomy, what we can measure. And so that leads to fMRIs and other objective measurement modalities and tools on the neuroscience side. But they're very separate as silos, and there's not much integration, there's not much communication between them. And so what we've discovered is that there is a way to bridge that gap. And that's part of what we use to help people to understand themselves at a deeper level using brainwave analysis and bridge that gap between psychology and neuroscience, between the mind and the brain. We look at them as 50% of the equation in each of those silos. So So that's a little bit of the background in terms of why they're separate. And G, I wanted to kind of turn it over to you to share a little bit about your discoveries around brainwaves and how you were able to bridge that divide and how you were able to understand that there is indeed a connection between the mind and the brain, between the fields of psychology and neuroscience, and then how we're able to use that to create a new understanding and then ultimately a new modality for helping people with mental health, wellness, performance, and other goals like that.
Thank you. And first of all, I just want to say it's great to be here. Thank you, Scott, for inviting us. And I really appreciate what you're doing with this podcast and in the world. I feel privileged to be among you here.
It's an honor.
I suffered from a history of anxiety issues. My father was an alcoholic, so we had a lot of issues at the home. And I had a bout of depression that lasted me 7 years. And so I've struggled quite a bit, which is kind of what got me on the road to trying to figure out my psychology. And I read a lot of research papers, a lot of books, did online courses. Well, back then it was correspondence courses. We didn't have online courses. And so they would mail us the book, and we would write it all out and then mail it in for them to grade it and send it back to us. Not that I'm that old. So yeah, I was doing this back in the 80s and 90s. And so it was kind of pre-internet courses. And so all my study helped me a little bit. And I just kept searching, and I tried all sorts of different modalities and diet and exercise routines and everything I could, and yet I still had this depression. And I realized at some point that it was sleep based. And so I went in for sleep studies, and the neurologists were like, "Oh, you're sleeping fine, your brain's working great." And no one really spoke to me about my mind and my mental state around sleep. And so I figured out through the psychology how to be happy by the end of pretty much every day. I learned how to cope. I was an excellent expert coper, and I would just cope with whatever my body wanted me to feel, and wasn't really learning how to change that. And so I
And can
kept.
you just real quick, G, can you like, what is an example of a coping? Because I'm sure there might be people that are living the same experience but might not know it. Like, how would you make yourself feel better throughout the day?
At first, I used affirmations. So I would wake up, and before I was thinking, when I woke up every morning, my first feeling was there is really no reason for me to live, and that I should just not do anything. And I did spend a lot of days in bed at that time. So I wasn't really able to live life. And I realized that actually made me feel worse. And so I realized, oh, if I feel this way, then what I really want to do is cope with the feeling and understand the truth that if I get up and do things, I actually feel better. And that took me taking the action to actually, there's an old saying, to fake it until I make it, right? And so I learned that if I can't get myself to think right, maybe if I get myself to act right, then I can feel better. And I tried it and tried it out, and it worked. And so I started to have a routine in the morning, and that's how I would cope with how I felt. And then that actually moved into me understanding that I can't really trust my internal belief systems. I couldn't really trust how I felt. And I got to this idea that my body was actually lying to me, which may or may not be true. It was just my perception at the time. And so to cope with that, I would tell myself, oh, well, my opinion of how I feel about living my life doesn't matter. And that soon became a coping mechanism where I was able to learn how to cope with whatever my body was giving me by basically telling myself that those kinds of feelings don't fundamentally matter anymore. I did use a different F word when I was thinking in my head. Publicly, I say fundamentally matter anymore. And so that was how I coped with a lot of the patterns that were in my body that my body was giving to me on a daily basis. And I studied more and more about that. And then I found neurofeedback and really dove in to studying neurology and the neuroscience and the neurofeedback mechanism. And I found a system where I spoke with the inventor, and he invited me to come and stay with, and actually his office was 4 miles from my sister. And I went and stayed with my sister for 2 months and studied with him and learned as much as I possibly could. And by that time, I was relatively happy during the day because I was an excellent coper. Yet I was still waking up with that deep, dark. A lot of people might, relate with that feeling. It's almost like a Scotch hangover. It's just, ugh. And I would wake up like that every day, and go through my morning mental fitness routine, my coping mechanisms to feel relatively good, and then throughout the day feel happy. I used to focus on creating more positive energy than negative, and that was just my focus. And that helped me to kind of be happy. And as I was, studying with the inventor of this system, watching my brain waves, about 3 or 4 days in, I woke up without the depression. I wasn't in that deep, dark place.
Wow.
And I was watching my brain waves. Every day I was going in and we were doing sessions and I was learning about my brain waves. And that day there was a dramatic shift. I'm feeling goosebumps, remembering the moment. Oh my gosh, I can see it in the brain waves why I do not feel suicidal. And I actually haven't woken up with that deep, dark depression ever since. It's amazing to me.
It's so perplexing to me, and thank you for sharing that, G. It's an incredible story, and I'm sure one that maybe a lot of people can relate to. But we do live in this kind of scientific paradigm where we have placed such an emphasis on the brain, and it would just seem that like that would evolve into understanding our feelings and our thoughts by looking at the brain. And I'm just like perplexed why that connection has not been made, or it's not something that we really talk about. Like it's not popularized if it has been.
Well, lots of people, lots of neuroscientists have actually tried to cross that bridge, psychologists and psychiatrists. And the main issue is that when people look at the brain, they do it in the medical framework, right? And when we practice medicine, most of the time we try to find out what's normal and then help people get to normal. And in mental wellness and actually in neurological wellness, that may not really be the best way to go because we all have different frameworks physically as well as mentally, which requires different neurological frameworks to support that. Because our mind lives in the electricity of our nervous system all over our whole body. Yes, we're talking about the brain. However, the brain is a small part of the entire nervous system. And our cells and our nerves, every nerve cell has an understanding of its job. In other words, who am I and what do I need to do? Every nerve cell has a perspective of when it gets information or a stimulus of any kind, how am I supposed to process that? And so, as Joe Dispenza and Bruce Lipton speak about it, we have many different identities and individual belief systems inside of us. And if we aren't really understanding that there's a whole mental side, and science and medicine doesn't really fully understand the anatomy of how my thought of I want to raise my finger, how the anatomy knows that's what I want to do. They know how the mechanisms work once the intention is placed. They just haven't discovered that part. So by looking at the brain, they can't see the feelings and the intentions.
I think the other part historically is that the mind is kind of an abstract concept. And so the field of science is really based on what we can physically measure. And the field of psychology hasn't really had a tangible, objective, measurable thing historically. So there's a divide there from the medical model that G was referring to, where you're looking more at normative, average databases of objective data. That doesn't really exist in psychology. I think the other part of it, when you're dealing with the mind, and what part of that gap is that there is a benefit to understanding how the mind can be physically measured when you're able to consider the observer effect principle of mindfulness, that you are not your thoughts, right? You are not your thoughts. You are the observer of your thoughts. So you're creating a separation between you and the seat as the observer and the awareness that's experiencing those thoughts, and thus able to then perceive the thoughts more as a tangible physical object, as a subject of your perception. And that gives you the ability to have a different lens through which you can then start to measure what you're looking at, as opposed to being immersed in it as just being my thoughts throughout the day. And one other interesting example of that, as we talk to neuroscientists at top universities, they often say things like the mind is not a thing. So you're not
Pretty sure it's a thing because I have one.
right, but the terminology just almost falls apart when you're looking at it from that perspective, because then how do you define it? Is it a tangible thing? Yes, I have it, I have thoughts, but so many people are still so immersed in their thoughts that they're not able to understand that separation that you do, Scott, very well, just with that one statement of saying, I have a mind, but I'm not my mind, right? There's some separation there. There's some subject object dynamic that the Eastern traditions of mindfulness are very tuned into, but the Western paradigms of medical science are less attuned. Their level of consciousness, we could say, has not elevated to the level of being able to perceive that observer effect.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation so far. If you like what you hear, let me know by clicking like, subscribing to the channel, and responding with a comment around something that you found interesting in the conversation so far. In addition to these videos, I do a lot of writing on the exploration of consciousness and my own personal revelations in my newsletter called Consciousness: The Doorway to Human Evolution. To receive these updates and more, all you need to do is simply head to the link in the description below and you'll be added to the community of 20,000 plus consciousness explorers receiving weekly ideas and inspiration in their inbox. I look forward to hearing from you there. Now let's get back to the show. I think the other thing that I would share is like, yeah, just a reverence and appreciation for so much of that mind is outside of our awareness. You know, I forget, I think Simon Sinek, listened to some talk with him and he said 90 to 95% of the mind is outside of conscious awareness. And it's like, the difference is like a 4x4 foot room and like a 4 mile room or something like that. And so we have this vast accumulation impacting functioning, and yet we don't know that. And so, and because we don't know that and we can't see that, and a lot of us aren't focused on discovering that, it's kind of hard to connect the dots. And I think, one thing that was very interesting to me about the work that you're doing is you were able to look at my brain and or at least my brain waves, and tell me that it looks like you had some prenatal trauma that is unresolved. And that type of like anatomy mapping of these subconscious influences that are negatively impacting my experience was something that I didn't know existed. And it's certainly not something that is popularized in psychology. And so how did you start to make the connection between anatomy and something like traumatic events and even when they happened?
Well, I faced the exact issue that you're speaking about, that Chad was just talking about, in that there's not a well, almost any. There's very little information about with subjective, non-subjective information about the mind. And so one of my first tasks was to figure out how to create a framework where I could get objective data regarding the function of the mind and the existence of the mind. Because, like you said, I have a mind. Well, that's your subjective view. How do you prove you have a mind? Where can you show me on paper that you have a mind? And so, that without a subjective viewpoint. And that was my first task. And so I developed a standardized protocol for psychological treatment where I was monitoring the brainwaves. And so when you say I have a mind, that creates a brainwave pattern. Now, that pattern is going to have some little differences based on that 4-foot room compared to the 4 miles of information that are part of your life regarding your mind, as it would be for Chad or I. And so there's also a huge amount of similarity. And in that similarity, I was able to develop an objective framework for mental function. And the mental framework, or the objective framework of mental function that I have created, may be the first of its kind, which is why you haven't seen it, why we don't speak about it, because we have not. And that's why scientists and doctors often say the mind is not a thing, because there's no objective measurement or framework to point to and say, oh, that's the mind. And that's what we've been developing here at Supermind.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really funny. I don't know how someone could, I mean, I guess if you're just completely identified with your thoughts, then yeah, you just think that you are that, you don't think that I have this annoying neighbor in my house of awareness all the time that's constantly badgering me and telling me what to do that isn't actually me. And I think the one of the very other fascinating points that I'd like to bring up here is just how that impacts nervous system function. And I think a lot of us, it feels like subjects to our nervous system, where it's like we have all of these, just things that suck. Like, I feel really tight, or I feel really constricted, or my heart's racing, or like I'm sweating because of something that I'm nervous about, or whatever it is. Like, we have all these automatic bodily functioning that we're just subject to, and we've become so accustomed to, we don't even realize that there's another way outside of that. And so I'm interested to hear more about like your sense of a continuum of going from that state to actually moving to a place of more becoming the master of the system, telling it what to do and how that can impact your life.
There's a really cool study that you guys may have seen with the Cleveland Clinic that showed that someone who's visualizing exercise actually has physiological changes in their muscles without doing any physical activity. So if you just think of applying that to your brain and applying that to your thoughts, we have that power to visualize, to use affirmations, and we call it self-directed neuroplasticity. We're creating new neural pathways all the time, including in this moment right now. So what we focus on literally grows inside of our brain. And it's this incredible hack, right, Scott, to your point, that we can actually start to drive the neural pathway creation in our nervous system with our mind, with our intention. And it's really not that hard. It's just a matter of focus and following a process and guiding principles around it. And I wanted to also go back to one of the points we were making earlier about these coordinates, about the map of the brain, about our ability to measure what's happening in the mind. And historically, this hasn't been an objective measurement for the field of psychology. But when you go through your own personal experience, it's so obvious that this information is valuable because each region of the brain has a function. The frontal lobe has a function, the parietal lobe has a different function. Each frequency band, each brainwave frequency band, delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma, each of them has a function. And each hemisphere of the brain has a function. So just right there, you're getting up to over 100 different data points and coordinates. And it's obvious that this information can be beneficial, even if it's just for our own self awareness. Like G said in his story, he was waking up in a state of depression, suicidal. And then after creating this new modality and using it on himself, he was waking up without depression and he could see the brainwaves were different. Just that one fact is all it takes to understand that there's a way to bridge these divides. And what I love about brainwaves and EEG is that the technology is so cheap. We're talking about $1 sensors. So the other challenge sometimes with neuroscience is the neuroscientists don't think EEG is very sexy. They're like, this thing's been around for decades. We don't care about EEG. Like, we want to look at $100,000 magnetic imaging, fMRI, all the latest and greatest stuff. That's what we're looking at. Well, okay, but then it's a lot harder to create an iterative modality using real world evidence to bridge this divide, right? If you have really expensive equipment and people have to sit in it for a long scan. So there's some other little nuggets sprinkled in there that I wanted to share because I think they're relevant to the conversation.
And I'd like to add the practical side of all of this. You were speaking about how things feel on a daily basis. Our nervous system tries to normalize everything. So, whatever it's doing to you, it also gives you the message this is normal. Deal with it rather than, oh, you can change it. And Pavlov, with his dog, proved a long time ago that we can condition our nervous system to function the way we want, intentionally, intellectually, consciously. And so that power really gets elevated when you can have an objective measurement of how it's going. And when you take that objective measurement for your brain and then now can compare it to 1,000 other people like we have at Supermind, then you can really help people understand the frameworks that they can attain and how much you can. And a hack that we discovered by studying the data while doing the psychological interventions is that there's a base human desire, need to feel safe, to feel in control. And so the unconscious creates these irrational control mechanisms like, twitching. I'm feeling better because I can do this no matter what you say to me. And the unconscious does that to us in order sometimes just to feel safe when we already are safe. Seems like a waste of my time. And there's another hack to this which is kind of what you're alluding to, that if I can live from love instead of fear, the unconscious naturally is looking for and surveying the environment and what's going on around us to see how it relates to us, to see if we're safe, constantly looking for what's wrong in order to keep us safe. And well, if you're constantly looking for what's wrong and that's growing inside of you, then how great are you going to feel? And so a very simple hack is to flip that, to live from love and realize we get to be on this podcast. I'm not sitting here worrying about what we're doing wrong. I'm sitting here enjoying this to a very high degree because we get to be here with you. It's absolutely awesome.
You focus on what you want to see happen in your life instead of ruminating on what could go wrong. And then you're also hitting on one of the principles of the law of attraction, right? You want to focus on what you want to see more of growing in your experience. The other thing that's interesting here around the concept of love and how it gets commingled with our survival mechanisms in our nervous system. We've been talking about the unconscious mind. We've been talking about safety. A lot of what we do is help people to down regulate unnecessary fear, unnecessary fight or flight response that can cause anxiety and stress and sleep issues and many other things. And love becomes a part of this because as 7, 8-year-old kids, if we don't have the love of our caretakers, then we usually can't physically survive. We're dependent on their love and care to survive. So, for many people, myself included, as an 8-year-old, I created a belief system which was based on misunderstandings of my worthiness of my parents' love in order to be physically safe. And that core part of my psychology, and for many human beings, this is the case. Later in life, I'm 35 years old, and that same misunderstanding is still subconsciously running how I'm perceiving events that happen in my life. I get an email from a client and it could trigger an unnecessary fight or flight response related to my misunderstanding of my worthiness of being lovable, going back to that 8-year-old limiting belief that we now have the ability to measure subconsciously and invite people to let go of and rewire and reprogram these subconscious parts to however best serves them in their lives. And that gives a little more tangibility to the concept of love. Why is love important in this conversation? Why is love a factor in the nervous system? How can we measure survival mode related to worthiness, related to love? And that's the connection.
I love it. I definitely can relate to yeah, given my body some shitty instructions as a kid. And I think I want to dive in deeper into some of these concepts, but I think one thing that would be helpful to orient us is just definitions around subconscious and unconscious, which I know you have a distinction around, G. And so why don't we start there?
That's a really good point. Very good question. In fact, the world of psychology and the world of neuroscience doesn't have a very strong definition. And that was one of the things that I decided was very important, especially in the objective measurement, because each unconscious, subconscious, conscious thought comes with a perception. It comes from a belief system for those distinct layers of our minds. And so I related the two together. And so the Freud and Jungian iceberg model of the unconscious, subconscious, and conscious is a pretty good model. The idea is that the conscious is above water and everything else, the sub and unconscious, are underwater. And iceberg 10% above water, and it's pretty close to our conscious, sub, and unconscious frameworks. And so I have defined through all of the practice that we've done over 3,000 patients and 30, 40,000 different brain scans, that the unconscious really exists in the frequency bands of electricity that we create inside of ourselves, all through our bodies and our brains, from 0 to 3 hertz. A hertz is 1 wave of electricity per second. And then subconscious is from 3 to 15, and then conscious is 15 and above. And volume wise, even though the frequency bands are smaller, the height of the wave, the strength, the volume of those waves is typically 75 to 85% of a person's psyche. And so that's what we're measuring. And each section has its own belief system, perceptions, and abilities for communication. And that's a big part of what's important, is to learn how to have a relationship, because it's all part of us.
I
It's
want to
important to have a
share
relationship with all of that.
I want to share one of the extraordinary benefits of having EEG sensors on your head while you're doing mental exercises. So, G's talking about belief systems in the unconscious mind. How do we measure that? One way that we can do that is giving prompts such as an affirmation or a conditional affirmation, which is a less direct form of the affirmation. So instead of saying, I am safe, a conditional version of that would be, I want to feel safe. It's a little bit lighter. It's a little bit easier for parts of the sub and unconscious that may not fully agree that I am safe to start to agree with that intention, with that concept. And then while we're doing those directed thought exercises in a session, we're measuring the unconscious brainwaves. And we'll see if there's resistance to that affirmation in specific regions of the brain and specific frequency bands. And if there's a spike, if there's a resistance in the theta brainwave frequency band in the parietal lobe during that specific conditional affirmation of, I want to feel safe, that indicates that there is a disagreement of that intention, of that proposed belief in the subconscious belief that's measurable in theta in the parietal lobe. We then use that spike of resistance, as an understanding for a prompt that we can give back to the individual to help them to process if there's any story around what that belief might be. It could be an early childhood experience related to a physical trauma in the body, for example, because the parietal lobe is responsible for the mind body connection. So it's this great nugget of enhanced awareness. It's data driven by the measurable unconscious belief systems that then helps that person to move forward and accelerate their progress much faster than you could do if you were just doing a talk therapy modality where you have none of that information about what's happening in the sub and unconscious part of the brain.
Yeah, it's really man, it's so interesting because yeah, we can't see beyond our own boundaries of conscious awareness, right? And so we have to look for these subtle cues uh in how we react. And my experience has been, as you go on that journey, it just your awareness just becomes incredibly more refined. Like you start to notice like the very, 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 very small subtleties in both the mind activity, your body activity, all of it. But I think what you're saying is you don't have to actually be a 13-year meditator like me to start to detect those things with EEG. You know, you can you can actually just have an objective data set that says, hey, like when I say I'm enough, like this wave goes like this, and might want to look into that a little bit. Which I think is awesome. And I think one of the ideas, G, that I found so fascinating with this is like this notion that the mind and the body are partners. There's a partnership there. And the body requires communication, or else it will just start processing things on its own or whatever past communication it has been fed. I'd love for you to talk more about that dynamic and how it shows up.
So, like Chad was just saying, if we see a elevated brainwave in an area of the brain, different level areas of the brain develop it during different times of our lives. And so the occipital lobes develop prenatally up to age 8. And then the parietal lobes really develop their patterns that they're going to keep from ages 8 to 20, 25. And so when we see an imbalance there, we can tell based on what level of the mind it is, whether it's eyes closed or eyes open, right brain, left brain, the characteristics of that imbalance. So I can say things to you like, hey, there were some issues in the first couple of years of your life, and actually prenatally, that caused a belief system in your unconscious regarding your life. And understand that your unconscious is processing all the vibrations of the world and giving you a perception of what they mean way before you're aware of it. And you're probably, like you were saying earlier, only aware of about 10% of it, because most of it gets filtered out and your body's reacting to it without talking to your brain. We keep talking about the brain. However, it's our nervous system. And so our hearts, there's the cardiac nervous system that is doing as much or more than the brain ever is. And the brain doesn't find out about all of it because our hearts have a lot of responsibility and a lot of awareness. And so most of the conditioned awareness comes from the experiences of life. However, there's also a large component of that that's born in epigenetics, which the science of epigenetics tells us can go back 7 generations. And it's been my experience that most of that that affects us is unreconciled issues that are passed down through the actual nervous system and the cells and the tissue. And so the mind and the brain are a true partnership. The mind, whatever you think, if you just think about apples for the next 90 days, your body's going to start to crave it physically. And so it's an amazing dynamic, again, proven by Pavlov and his bell and his meat. And yeah, that's a big part that's so important to be aware of, because what you think about grows in your body.
Yeah. So I think to tie this together, it's like life gives our life and our just like ancestral lineage, epigenetics, they give our body instruction sets. And we're the inheritors of those instruction sets by and large until we start to take conscious agency and communicate to the nervous system how we want it to function, you know? And I think like being from a place of love, like what would love do is like an amazing example of that. But I think you can even, it's my observation with my own nervous system, and I think you guys would believe the same, that you can actually tell the body how to function. And you hear yogis talk about this where they refer to their body as if it's like a lap dog, and they're like, body, go to sleep. You know, they give it instructions, or body, have a restful night of sleep. Don't wake up fully restored. And we have this like incredible agency and power that we just don't use because we don't know about it. Man, it's just such an awakening to that power. Is just so freaking amazing.
It is amazing, and the way I think about that is that the body is meant to serve us. It's meant to help us. These lower levels of the unconscious and subconscious are part of us, and they're doing what they think is best for us. So if there's a misunderstanding or a misalignment, then that can be corrected pretty easily. Like, we're all rowing in the same direction here. We're all in the same team. That's actually one of our visualizations, is imagine your body is all team members and you're the team captain. You say, hey guys, we're going to get really amazing restful sleep tonight. And that was one of the hacks. I'm happy that that's coming up, because that's one of the great techniques that people can apply right now, which is that if you want to sleep better, start directing your nervous system to give you restful, rejuvenating sleep.
I just want to applaud Scott, your what you just said. I mean, so on point. And I love that you're saying it from the experience of that awareness, being able to apply it to your life to be able to enjoy your life more. And I mean, what value can you place on enjoying your life more without having to do or create or anything? Although you do want to create good, happy energy as a part of that. And you know, I really what you said, and I love that instructions for function that you talked about the epigenetics. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to start using that.
Start using it, man. Start using it. Well, it's I will give credit to the wisdom tradition I've studied that talks about this, where, you know, our consciousness has the capacity to transmit information. And that can be transmitted to our body as our as our hearts open, it can be more meaningfully transmitted to other beings. And yeah, that idea of just like, you know, you are the master giving instructions is a really powerful frame. And I appreciate what you said, Chad, where it's like it is trying to help us. Like everything is trying to help us, and it is just we've just due to our misperception, due to our misunderstanding, it is helping us with a set of uninformed instructions that are coming from a very not true reality place. And there's so many examples of that in my own life. And I think one of the things that we worked with at Supermind was just this idea that my unconscious was holding on to that was likely imprinted while I was not even out of my mother's womb, that I was not safe, you know? And so it's like this crazy distorted lens to perceive reality through and to function from. And the good news is that we have a power to do something about it.
Absolutely.
There's a big misconception about that idea, I am safe. The unconscious gets very confused because the safety isn't just for our physical body. Remember, we're mind and body. And so the nervous system is very concerned about the safety of our identities. So when we show up and I am a son, I am a father, I am a brother, I'm a teacher, I am a business owner, I've been a serial entrepreneur for most of my life, I gravitate towards that. My unconscious wants to keep all of that safe. And originally for Homo sapiens, this is very good. This is very normal. If you're wandering around the Serengeti alone, you're going to get eaten. So it's important to be a member of a tribe and keep your identity in that tribe. The issue is the world has developed. And how many tribes are we members of? The unconscious cannot possibly keep us safe. As when I say safe, every identity in every tribe, keep it safe, it's impossible. And so that's why there's so much anxiety and depression and really PTSD that's affecting the world. And that's why it's so important that you keep speaking out. And I really appreciate you inviting us to be part of this podcast, to be able to help the world understand that anxiety, even though the body thinks and wants you to think it's normal, doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
That's how I met Chad.
Totally. And our nervous system is dealing with a lot in this era of technology. So you're adding the level of stimulation. We're getting millions of bits of information through our smartphone. And the nervous system hasn't really been taught as to how to handle this information. So this always on culture is creating unnecessary questions, survival mode, hypervigilance. And it just underscores the value of taking more directed agency to be able to program, to rewire, and to use our conscious agency to do so in the era that we're in. We talked about the life experiences being part of the programming or the conditioning. There's also a lot of societal influences. And what we pay attention to is so important. So again, it goes to what we're focusing on literally grows inside of our brains, which is part of our body. So if I'm focusing on, we'll just use an easy target for this, the news. If I'm focusing on the news and the news looks very scary, that's going to be creating more imprinting of fear or worry or what if scenarios that things could go wrong. And so we have the agency to direct our attention to what we want to focus on and remove our attention from some of the societal influences or the overstimulation through technology that's creating a new challenge for our nervous systems and place it on some of the tools that we've talked about here.
Yeah, I like this because I think a lot of people feel like the odds are stacked against them, you know, where it's like, shit, man, I'm like set up to fail on this thing. And look, I'm not, there's some truth to that, but you can do something about it. like you can take your power back and you don't have to live in victimhood, and you can actually, start to be intentional about, just not being a victim to the environment. One thing I did want to bring up, because I know a lot of people listening to this show, they like biohacking, they do all the things, and today everybody's all about HRV when it comes to measuring the nervous system function. And I just am curious to get your perspective on how helpful that actually is in the grand scheme of things of what we're talking about.
I think the HRV measurements are very, very helpful in being able to assess how you're processing what's happening around you. It's a very kind of a small component, and very, like Chad was saying earlier, there are many different parts of us that are involved with every moment. And the HRV is a great measure of, how you're handling stress and anxiety. So it's nice to watch it. However, to me, there's a lot more to look at. So we spend a lot of time looking at the others. However, I enjoy watching the HRV pretty much in anything that I'm working on. I mean, it's another objective measure of how you're functioning. So to me, all objective measures are very valuable and useful. There's a organization called Thought Technologies that combines multiple ones on one screen, and it's great. So I really enjoy those kinds of tools.
I remember when we were speaking, I guess the point I was trying to underscore was, so HRV deals with kind of the nervous system with the heart, but like our nervous system in totality is, I mean, much vaster, right? Like our freaking stomach has our gut has a nervous system, our, like all these different parts of our body have their own systems. And yeah, I think there's just like a shitload more going on in the nervous system than HRV shows us. It shows us a part of it.
Yes, like Chad was speaking earlier about the news. When you start thinking about what's happening on the news, your spine is probably going to react. So the nervous system of the exoskeletal system is reacting to how to support you with the concern around the news, which the HRV may or may not reflect. Your stomach now has to know how to digest your food to get you ready for everything that's going on in the news that you feel is related to you. And so now your digestive system is making adjustments that your HRV is not going to affect. So yes, there's 12 systems in the body that all have their own nervous system, and they're all, they're interdependent oscillating systems. So when one changes, all the others change. And that's why it's nice to look at multiple objective measurements at the same time.
Makes sense. Well, maybe we'll have whoops for our bellies before you know it. I I think we've done a pretty good job of like outlining to me what feels like really valuable information. And honestly, just kind of the state of such formative parts of well-being, like psychology and just how that's functioning as a system today. What tips would you give people who are like, okay, I'm a believer, I want to experiment with this in my own life? Like where would they get started? And we can talk about at the end about what Supermind does, but let's just assume they aren't in the Miami area and can do Supermind.
Well, first of all, I'm proud to say that I last year became a bestseller at Amazon with my book, How to Live Anxiety Free. I would recommend picking up that book and reading it. And it has very easy to apply teachings to apply to your life, because we don't have to live with anxiety. We get to live anxiety free. And we can change everything. Neuroplasticity proves that. So pay attention to how to do that. Another way to do that is also how we communicate. Let's start to move into positive languaging, positive thinking. There's so much information to guide people in all of those areas. Remember, what you focus on grows. And let's get rid of the word should.
Yeah, that's one I was going to say also that resonates with different groups that we've had come in, which is it underscores the benefit of thinking positively. And beyond that, the benefit of all the mindfulness techniques, that there's a way to measure the results objectively in the mind, in the brain, and this stuff works. So anything that people are doing in mindfulness, whether it's meditation, whether it's yoga, retreats, and the more they can think positively and focus on what they want, focus on gratitude, what's going really well in their lives as much as possible, to know from this new awareness that what they think about literally grows inside their brain. It's that important to be intentional about our thoughts, to try to be aware of our thoughts, to catch our thoughts if they start going negative, and to bring them back into more of a positive framing. The other two things I would add quickly are one, that we can measure this. So just knowing that it's measurable can give some people relief. And whether they're able to come to Miami or not, or we're able to come to wherever they are, or they find someone else that's doing something similar, just knowing this stuff is measurable. So it gives that concrete, practical action steps that can come from this. Now I know why my emotions are this way, or why my thoughts are a certain way, or why I have certain behaviors and patterns. A lot more awareness around it. And then secondly, and this is what G already said, which is we have the power to change it. So I love to just remind people, nobody is stuck with their brain ever. Anyone that is experiencing challenges, struggles, depression, anxiety, PTSD, nobody is stuck with that condition. Everyone can change their brain. We all have this power of neuroplasticity. And just that awareness, we've heard from people, has helped give them relief to be able to sleep better, knowing that there is some escape. We're not stuck. We're not captive in whatever our thought patterns are.
And with whatever you're doing, the retreats, the reading, the practice, the yoga, the meditation, please add a communication with your unconscious to create that energy from here on out. Because you get to condition your nervous system, communicate how you want it to function in the future.
I love that. And there is a nuance here because I know on this podcast, we've talked a lot about shadow work, and I'm someone who's benefited immensely from not just being like, I'm well, I'm well, I'm well, I'm well, I'm well, right? And actually being like, oh, whoa, shit. There's like a lot of stuff in the subconscious that says differently, and I better look at that. So how do you advise striking the balance between that type of work of discovering stuff that maybe says otherwise, and also the positive thinking that you advise?
G, do you have a perspective you want to jump in with first? Otherwise, I have something. I think our answers will be different, so it'll be interesting.
I love self discovery. Knowing thyself is very, very important. Developing discernment, especially in meditation and with positive thinking. It's interesting because we were speaking earlier about affirmations, and I got the privilege of watching brainwaves when somebody would say, I'm safe, and watch the conscious say, oh, this is good. And then the unconscious come flying in, and then they have this little self argument going on. And I can watch it in the brainwaves. And so that led us to the conditional affirmations, to being able to have an open communication with ourselves. And that way, the shadow work becomes a lot lighter, a lot actually more enjoyable, because we're getting to know ourselves better, and we're able to love and nurture ourselves throughout that shadow process. And I like to speak with people about whatever is happening in their lives, to spend some time in meditation developing that discernment of what's that information? What is the message here? And then being able to process through that. It's, to me, that's one of the greatest joys of living, right? Is being able to walk through emotions that I used to think were I have to stay away from, right? And now I get to just dive in and swim around and enjoy them and really get to know them and then figure out, hey, how do I want to live with this from now on? And we get to condition our system to do whatever it is, like Chad was just saying. We can change it. Let's go.
I love it. I love the discernment and the love and acceptance piece. I personally have done quite a bit of shadow exploration myself, and there are many tools that have come up along the way. There have been many challenges that have come up through experiencing certain darker aspects of myself that I wasn't aware of or that were hard to accept. And I found that one of the best tools for processing is to love that part of myself, loving the unlovable, the previously disowned or shamed part, and bring it into awareness through that love. And so that is a good connecting concept to the positive thinking. That it's not just love all the time, but when things come up, we do guide people to process them. We don't want to bypass or push down certain traumas that are difficult to experience and to feel. We want to process them. We want to gain the wisdom from them, as G was saying. So there's some different lenses. There's the love perspective. There's the gratitude perspective. What am I learning from this? How can I use it how can I turn it into a superpower that I was able to go through this darker stuff and then come out of it with more insight or whatever it is. And the other thing I was going to say is I like to use feeling good as a compass for navigating the balance of applied positive force with my intention. Okay, I can just push in a positive direction. Gratitude, 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 gratitude. But Scott, your point is, well, wait a second. You can't just jump to gratitude. Some crazy shit just popped up, and we're not ready for that yet, right? We're
No.
like, we got to go be in the mud of shame or whatever it is, fear, guilt, are probably the big ones that can come up for some people. So, yeah. So then how do I figure out if I'm going too strongly and pushing gratitude? I try to tune into the way I feel about it and use some of that, just my emotional intelligence, body sensing, and intuition. Well, hey, the gratitude, I'm kind of forced it. It feels like I'm forcing it too much and I'm not really processing through. So then you're kind of picking up some cues from the sub and unconscious there of like, we got to look at this thing, we got to let it go, we got to process it, we got to feel it. And then there's this kind of release. Okay, now I feel more open in my body, I feel more energy opening up. Now I'm ready to move my focus back into a love, gratitude, intention.
Yeah, definitely. I would say it's an art,
All right.
striking this balance, and one that dynamically evolves as you evolve.
Totally.
So if people are listening to this and they're like, all right, this sounds dope. I want to measure my brain waves and get to the bottom of how to just be happier and more joyous as a default state. What does working with Supermind look like?
So it starts with a brainwave map, and we're measuring 200 different data points. It's a bit like an X-ray for your mind or a GPS for your mind. So just that first step can be really beneficial for people because it gives them that brainwave self-awareness to understand, here are the patterns that I've experienced and now I know why. And then we personalize a program of sessions based on that brain map that takes them in the direction they want to go based on their goals, based on their brainwave data. Usually the program is 10 sessions. We have people that fly in for a week, so you can do 2 sessions a day. You can do the accelerated program, which I think is actually what you did, Scott. And sometimes people stay for 2 weeks. And then we conclude with another brain map so that we show the objective before and after results. The sessions themselves are a combination of things. It's mindfulness, visualizing, affirmations, meditations, breath work. We also have a coach that we pair people with one-on-one to apply these tools and techniques to their specific life situations. And then we do brainwave training, which is also referred to as neurofeedback. But we have a very different way of doing neurofeedback from what else is out there. It's really not comparable at all because we've included the mental exercises and the understanding of the mind-brain framework in a very cohesive model. And then we also use optimal brainwave targets instead of average brainwave targets. But the neurofeedback component is a key part of this because it's a holistic way of guiding your brain waves using sound. We've worked with a sound healer. We've got these really cool sounds, and the sounds are giving you information about what's happening in your brain and what's happening in your subconscious mind. So it's almost like a mirror into your brain, and that's a great tool. That's a key part of our sessions and a key part of our process.
And I'd like to add that we're in Miami, Florida. It's a great place to visit. Come and see us. And in as little of a week, you can have 20 years of change. As well, we love to travel. So we'll come to you too.
We can travel. It's good for mental health, depression, anxiety, PTSD. We've had benefits for ADHD and addiction as well. And then on the wellness side, on the performance improvement, biohacking, stress, sleep, overall performance, cognitive performance are some of the key ones that people come through and have really significant benefits.
Awesome. Well, we'll link out the supermind.us website so people can check that out as they see fit. And thanks again, guys. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Scott.
Thanks for having us on, Scott.
Really appreciate it. And thank you for taking the journey with us.